Welcome to The Christian Atheist, episode number 26. Thoughts on Hegel, part 3. Upon listening to the last edition of The Christian Atheist, in which I made a point of Marxian determinism, my nephew Josiah replied to me, "I don't think I follow you on, quote, values being dictated to, and the individual being a, quote, cog in the dialectical machine, because it certainly runs counter to a Marxian ethics that is built on awakening the individual to its place within an artificially imposed value system perpetuating itself on a stasis of power." Far from disagreeing with Josiah on this point, it was this contradiction towards which I was driving with my commentary. Marx's philosophy asserts both determinism and freedom. Both that what people do and decide matters, and that it doesn't. That is, both that ethics are and are not real. He is both deterministic and prescriptive. Ethics is both an illusion and the most important of all realities. It is the duty of the proletarian to revolt against his oppression. The proletariat should be awakened to its class sense, to revolt against its chains. And this awakening is inevitable, determined by the materialist dialectic. Marx declares in the Communist Manifesto, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And in another place, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. My central claim in this series of episodes is that Hegel is the nearly omnipresent malign spirit against which we Kantian forces continue to struggle. In this episode, I want again to concentrate our attention on Hegel, but through this lens of Marxian contradiction. Marx is the first in a long line of what I will call the prescriptive Hegelians. I will try to flesh this term out as we move forward. I've already made the case that Hegel's philosophy is fundamentally descriptive, that he takes a God's eye view, looking back from the present moment, telling the story of spirit's ever-ascending path to self-consciousness. We shall term this confidence in reason's progress Hegelian optimism. For Hegel, spirit, which is another term for reason, is free. We can never predict what spirit will do next. The sole job of the Hegelian philosopher, however, is the retrospective reconstruction of the progress of spirit, in which each step is necessary and follows with deterministic certainty from that which came before. Spirit's story follows the logic of its nature. What spirit does is always consistent with itself. In this way, we discover that for Hegel, freedom and determinism are wholly compatible. The same thing, seen from two different perspectives. By dissolving all real opposition, all barriers between beings, we can see the practical outplay of this both-and structure of Hegelian logic. We can also see how contradiction is ignored in Marx's dialectical materialism, which simply is the application of Hegelian logic, and I would argue the pattern of his idealistic metaphysics, to an economic socio-political matrix. Aristotelian logic, remember, is either or. We are free, or we are not free. We cannot be both. Aristotelian logic forbids contradiction. Hegelian logic embraces it. Marx's many contradictions have never seemed a problem to Marxists, and Hegelian logic is the best way to understand this lack of concern. Hegelian logic is the paradigm of thought in the modern West, and especially in academia and elite intellectual circles, not to mention popular culture and media, which slavishly apes the elite. As my graduate advisor used to say, Hegel's logic is constantly being reinvented as though it is a new discovery, when, in fact, it is the very foundation on which almost all philosophy since Hegel has stood. We should now look more closely at what I have termed Hegel's optimism and its correlative evaluative relativism. Our first gloss on this optimism was that spirit is essentially progressive, that the march of history is upward, that evil is only an appearance, not a reality, that the end of spirit's advancement justifies whatever means spirit adopts, that spirit and its process to progress is good, and that therefore the only bad is that which stands against the progress of reason. Perhaps the best way to support this understanding of the quotation, is the quotation from the preface to Hegel's Philosophy of Right that we have noted several times before. Quote, "All that is real is rational, and all that is rational is real." We must understand that the logico-metaphysical movement of spirit is tendentious, self-motivated, that rationality is an ascent, accepting missteps, and never a decline. This is an element of faith for Hegel, as it is essential to his system. But that faith carries on into his followers, the PREscriptive Hegelians, Marx being the first. For an Aristotelian, who asserts a metaphysical plurality, not a monism, such metaphysical optimism would be highly suspect. But for an Hegelian, it is axiomatic, as reason is all there is, and reason simply is the process of ascent. No real barriers can oppose its forward march. What reason does is, ipso facto, good. Though it must be noted that the historical march of reason sometimes presents barriers to progress of its own making. These barriers can be rational missteps or, more likely, rational structures which have passed their time, representing an earlier, less advanced, more primitive, anachronistic moment of spirit, which should be overcome, but will not, quote, "go gentle into that good night." This should, for Hegel, remains non-prescriptive, as reason will always ultimately coincide with itself, whatever opposition it faces. There are two characteristic responses to these earlier versions of spirit's self-manifestation. The first is what I call Hegelian relativism. As manifestations of reason, all earlier and contemporary stages of spirit should have an equal dignity as moments in spirit's progress, as chapters in her story. No culture or person is bad for Hegel. Each of the players on spirit's stage is equally necessary to the narrative, and thus there is a democratic attitude not only of live and let live, but of tolerance in the contemporary usage of that term, acceptance, even celebration in the diversity of spirit's work. While within the process of spirit, disparate value judgments are necessary. From the perspective of the thesis, the antithesis is bad, and from the antithesis, the thesis is bad. The perspective of the absolute, the God's eye perspective, is that both positions are good. That is, necessary for spirit's self-actualization. While the differences between the moments are relevant at the ground level, for the absolute, no value distinction is relevant. This is what I mean by Hegelian relativism. All products of spirit are good, not least because as determined, they could not be other than they are. And so no moral fault can be assigned them. They are the products of the system that produced them. This is a logical consequence of Hegel's philosophy as a theodicy. If evil does not exist because everything is spirit, then negative valuations on spirit's manifestations are forbidden. In pantheism, all is God, and thus all is good, since it could not be otherwise. This exalted evaluation, however, can issue only from above the struggle, from the God's eye view, and never, so to speak, from down in the trenches, where spirit struggles to resolve the conflict. Here, the negativity of competing value judgment is the very substance of the struggle to overcome the thesis through the opposition of the antithesis, so as to arrive at that exalted position from which the Hegelian relativism issues. The second characteristic response results when the philosopher ceases to be a neutral observer from the God's eye viewpoint, like Hegel. So long as one assumes that the action of spirit is wholly determined, the role of the philosopher is only that of observer. But when one arrogates not only God's perspective, but also his position as legislator and judge, a new relation to the progression of dialectic is born, and description gives way to prescription. In this new role, another characteristic of Hegelian logic comes to the emphatic forefront, the dialectic of self and other. I am a self only in relation to other selves. So while I first conceive of myself as a self-contained individual, as soon as I conceive myself as such, I give rise to the notion of an other self-contained individual, who is not me, who stands in opposition to me. And thus the self, thesis, gives rise to the other, antithesis. Self and other can remain in isolation and opposition, or they can unite in the higher resolution, the synthesis, of the we, which contains both the self and the other. In attaining the resolution, though, the self must give up its rigid individuality, recognizing that self is posited only as relation to its other, with whom it is, thus, inextricably tied. Thus, the resolution of the conflict between self and other in the we both cancels and preserves the self. This is the Hegelian Aufhebung, or sublation. The ascent to the resolution of the conflict, the synthesis. For Hegel, this process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis is spirit's self-development. Incidentally, these terms, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, are not Hegel's, and a good case can be made that using them distorts Hegel's logic and philosophy. I would agree with this assessment, but as a shorthand, they do allow us a more dispassionate and straightforward presentation of his position. The thesis is the definite position that gives rise to its opposition, or its contradiction, in the antithesis, and in doing so allows for the higher resolution in the position that unites the terms of contradiction in the higher moment of synthesis. The thesis is that which must be overcome in order to advance the synthesis, and this is accomplished by the moment of opposition, the antithesis. For Hegel, all moments of spirit possess a democratic dignity and value. The deterministic value of spirit's progress means that the synthesis, when it comes, will be the necessary moment upon which the philosopher will report. Hegel describes spirit's progress, but he does not drive it. For the PREscriptive Hegelians, however, another perspective emerges. Arrogating to themselves not just the perspective of the absolute, but God's judicial authority and legislative power, spirit's moments cease to be value neutral. The philosopher now valuates, judges them. That which stands opposed to the resolution, the synthesis, the Aufhebung, is the thesis. And that which drives the synthesis forward is the antithesis. It is in this way that in the self-other dyad, it is the self that is denigrated as opposed to the synthesis, while the other, the antithesis, is privileged as the driver of the synthesis. The thesis is the retrograde position that should be opposed in order for the synthesis to arise. Thus, the PREscriptive Hegelian philosopher not only logically, but morally privileges the antithesis over the thesis. Thus arises a peculiar set of valuations due to the nature of the dialectic. The thesis, or the self, becomes the sole position upon which contempt must be poured. And all that is other than the thesis is exalted, as driving the resolution into synthesis. By judicial fiat, the philosopher legislates the superior value of the other, the opposition, the antithesis. Thus, in the hierarchy of value, the thesis, the self, must be overcome, overthrown, and all that opposes it must be exalted as the driver of synthesis, the end which the PREscriptive Hegelian philosopher values most highly. This is the dialectic of self and other, so prominent in post-Hegelian philosophy. It is telling, though, that the culpable self has always been transcended by the philosopher that judges it. I ask you once again to review the quotes from the Communist Manifesto given above. I hope to complete our series on the Cold War between Kant and Hegel in our next edition of the Christian Atheist. If this is the first edition of our channel you have watched, please subscribe below and let us know what you think in comments. First, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And let us know what you'd like to hear from us by commenting. Wise Words for Your Occasion is located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but we're willing to travel. For inquiries or to book an occasion, go to wisewordsforyouroccasion.wordpress.com or see us on Facebook or check out our YouTube channel. You'll find links to all three in this post.